Okay. So I'm going to thank Steve and blame Steve all in one sentence, because in January, he put together a slideshow about the class he's about to teach, about his steak leg stool. And I thought, well, and at the time it was just a slideshow. And I thought, well, that's kind of cool. And I had just finished a project that seemed kind of, well, it was interesting to me. So I thought it might be interesting to somebody else. And so I kind of put it together and then didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know if it was a show and tell or, you know, I put it together in January or February. And at that point in time, we didn't know what COVID was going to allow us to do or not to do. So eventually I talked with Joe Wheaton about it, and we made a couple of little changes here and there and tweaked it for a presentation like this. It's just a few slides, so it's more of an opportunity for people to get some insight into any kind of restoration, not just this particular table, but this particular table brought along quite a few interesting opportunities. The background behind this is that somebody that Steve had worked with in the past got hold of me and said he had an old oak table that had belonged in the family for a number of years, and his granddaughter wanted it, but it needed a lot of work. And I said, okay. And he brought it out to me, and I took a look at it. Part of the project was to refinish it, which is pretty straightforward. That's easy to provide a price for. But as you can see there, you can see a little bit, there were more problems than just refinishing it. It was completely delaminated. It was, as best as I could tell, this table was actually a marriage, I believe. It was originally a table that had a leaf, or at least one leaf, and I actually believe several leaves. So, you know, right in the middle, it split apart. It had been made into a coffee table. So at one point it was a dining table made into a pub table, made into a coffee table. That's what I think has happened over time. The next slide, I don't know why my buttons are having a problem here.
Just click on it and hit page down.
I don't have a page down. It's a MacBook.
Oh, down arrow.
Well, that's what I'm doing, but it's not going anywhere. There we go. A previous owner had made a number of modifications to this table that were intended to reinforce it so it wouldn't come apart. But my contention is that it actually facilitated the table coming apart. So the first thing you see is some plywood that was little plywood patches that were glued in place and then stapled in place. And what you may be able to tell, I think you can tell on the right-hand image, you can see that the table had some slides so that you could open it up and insert leaves. And they were screwed down. Can you see the cursor moving?
Yes.
Okay, those holes are normal. They're counterbored, and the holes are slightly oversized to allow for a little bit of movement. Those screws were not intended to be there. For good reason. That's to allow for wood movement. But somebody had screwed these things down. So now I had a bunch of boards that were forced to come apart because they had no place to go. So that required taking taking the table apart. Now, this is not the first time I've had an occasion to take a table apart, but I've never taken a tabletop apart in so many pieces. Fortunately, because of the age, these boards were glued together with hide glue, so it was fairly easy to get them apart. And that funny looking tool is actually, it's a Japanese tool that's used for stained glass. I purchased it probably 18 years ago when I was still living in Georgia from a guy that did a lot of stained glass work. And the reason I got it is because I was frequently having to take apart things. And it's a tool that's hardened steel, and it's an unusual shape. And I find it particularly well suited towards deconstructing something carefully. So a combination of that, and by the way, it's got a little, that's a steel end, so I can tap it with a hammer to help things along. So the combination of some hot water, that tool, and some wedges, and some patience, I was able to get those boards apart. And what's another thing about pieces of furniture from this age, they frequently, when those boards are laminated together, they are frequently tongue and grooved. So that tends to complicate the process of separating the boards a little bit. Sorry, I'm going to mute myself for a second. You don't want to hear that. Sorry, I'm back. Another thing that's interesting about antiques is that you might think that all of those boards are parallel edges, but they had no reason to make them parallel. And they certainly didn't have table saws with flesh sensing cartridges on them. So you might be able to tell it, and it's not just parallax. This particular board is not only looks because it narrower at that end than it does at that end because of parallax, but it probably was narrower at one end than the other. Several of those boards were. So that just added to the fun a little bit. The plywood patches, a friend of mine came over to look, and came over to visit one day, and he was looking at that and said, "How are you going to take that apart?" And he said, "Are you going to refinish it?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Just turn it upside down and fill it full of water." And I didn't quite do that, but I did soak those plywood patches considerably with hot water, and the tight bond just came off. The staples I cut off with a multi-tool. The almost parallel boards I cleaned up with the table saw, but then I had to deal with these two semicircular boards, and so I just made a couple of jigs so I could clean those up with on a table saw. Then I came to and jump in with questions at any time. I'm happy to answer them.
So you already might have answered this, Chip. This is Joe Wheaton, and but you said that that yellow glue just came apart just with water, or just with hot water, huh?
Yes, it didn't come it doesn't come apart like hide glue does, but it does come apart. Heat was part of the issue. one of the things that I have been learning over time is that you may think that a lot of glues, adhesives are permanent, but many of them are reversible, and Tight Bond 2 is one of them. But you have to get the temperature elevated a bit.
Could you use a heat gun, and would that do the same trick?
Yes, in this particular, yes, I would say yes. You take, depending on the heat gun, you do take some risk about potentially scorching the wood if you have a really high-powered heat gun. But if you add a little water, all I did was take a terry cloth rag and heat it up and with some, put it in some hot water and just soak it for a little bit and move it around a little bit. And I did use a heat gun, but I had water as a bit of a moderator. So I mean, it didn't happen fast, but it happened fast enough. And that would be more difficult with Type Bond 3 because it's supposed to be water resistant, if not waterproof. But Type Bond 2 is not. Now, did I know that it was Type Bond 2 to begin with? No, I had to take a guess. But it was a pretty good guess. And then the multi-tool helped quite a bit. And then there was some scraping and that kind of thing. And as you can tell that by having to trim all of these boards, certainly I have changed the diameter of this tabletop. And so as you see the boards come back together again, that blue arrow is showing you what the difference was. And since I was making it round again with a router on a shop-made trammel, I oriented I slipped matched the last board here so that I was cutting on the downslope with the router. So I specifically lined this up in this direction to take advantage of, to avoid the climb cut that I knew was going to happen. And this was a slow process. Moving that router around and just taking a little bit off at a time it's just a slow process. If I were to do it again, I probably would have done about half the thickness of the tabletop with a router and then come along with a jigsaw and kind of cut down the middle of that groove and then clean it up with a flush trim bit. But that isn't what I did. I in this particular case, I routed the whole thing off with a router. And
was it too big to put on a bandsaw jig to cut a circle?
Technically no, but in the space that's in my shop, I would have had to rearrange the furniture a bit. So I even though I have a pretty good sized shop, my machine room, my bandsaw is a little too close to my table saw. So I just chose to do it this way because I had plenty of space to do it.
So Chip, your trammel rig, I assume, has a fixed pivot point, and then it looks like you must have an adjustability with those two rods in that block. Is that the way you incremented the depth of cut?
Yes, that's exactly right. So the pivot block is right here. All I did was hot glue that to the bottom, to the underside of the table. You're looking at the underside of the table, and there are nuts on both sides of this. I've used this trammel for a number of things now, so it's a 1/4-inch piece of Baltic birch ply. And these are just all thread rods going through just a block of wood, and I can more or less micro adjust with those nuts. So it's pretty effective. And then of course the glue block, that pivot block just pops off when I'm done.
Did you glue this entire table together? You weren't planning on using it as a separatable table with a leaf in the center?
No, there was no leaf for it. When it came to me, there was no leaf for it. So there was no reason to leave it separated. I glued the whole thing up together.
And did you use biscuits or just standard jointed edges?
Actually, I thought I used dominoes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Now that you bring up an interesting question, because you remember that in the beginning, I pointed out that this table was from the mid 1800s. So what you think is a flat board is not a flat board. This tabletop had a lot of cup and twist to it, but by the time I delaminated all those pieces and then put them back together again. And so that was something that I had to deal with as well. So I was using a spiral bit. So it took me about an hour and a half to do this. And you can see, it coming apart at the end. So as I said, if I were to do this again, I would probably go halfway through the table with the router bit and then use a jigsaw to cut off the waste and flush trim it. It would probably speed it up quite a bit.
The added suggestion was that you can add a little vinegar to your hot water for any of the tight bond glues. It'll help break them down.
That's true. That's true. I had forgotten that at the time, but that is a true statement. Problem with getting older is I forget stuff.
Amen.
That's why we record these.
Okay, so this is a picture of the tabletop put back together again. There were a bunch. I don't know if you remember in the beginning. Let's go back to the beginning. There were water spots. There was all kinds of damage to this finish. There was some place, there was a dark spot in here. So I had to bleach. I had to do a number of things. And so that's what it looked like after I was done. And I said,
hey Chip, what did you use to bleach it with?
oxalic acid.
And did you do it real concentrated or just follow the directions, or?
I just followed the directions. In many cases, I continually find bleaching something a little bit of an experiment. One, oxalic acid sometimes works, sometimes doesn't.
Natural hair
Yeah.
dryer.
I was curious
When you
because I
zip up a
trying to
jacket,
take
put
some
it in the dryer,
black,
it comes out and zip.
Hang on a second. Bob Sokolow, can you?
I got it. I got them.
Okay, thanks. Go ahead.
I had
Steve.
some original windows in the house that were installed in like 1930, and over the years, water had come down and where the glass made contact with this wood, it blackened it. And so I was trying to lighten that up, and I tried to use oxalic acid, and I forget there was something else I was using, and I couldn't get it to really bleach out. I think it lightened it some, but it really didn't bleach it out like I thought it would. So I'm just curious about this whole bleaching technique.
Well, so was the glass encased in lead?
No. It was just brought down into the wood, and then it was the putty that you put on windows back then to secure the glass in the frame.
Okay.
The glazing.
Okay, and so there was no metal in contact that you're aware of?
No, not that I'm aware of. It, for some reason, it just blackened it right where the glass made contact with the wood. Maybe it's because the water sat in there over time and darkened it up. But it was done with like a shellac or I guess like an amber shellac or a mahogany kind of stain or whatever. It made the wood look dark like mahogany, and that might have, maybe the staining they were using had something to do with it. I don't know.
So for I'm trying to think of the number of different kinds of bleaches. There's oxalic acid, which is a two-part product. There's another, and the one that I use is made by Dailies. Dailies also puts out a part A and a part B type of thing. It's not oxalic acid. I don't recall what it is right off the top.
Oxalic acid isn't a two-part thing, is it? It's just a,
No.
okay,
No, oxalic acid, you just add water.
right.
And then there's a separate product to neutralize the wood. And it works for many things, but it doesn't work for everything. Then Dailies also makes a two-part product. It's a part A and a part B, and I usually mix it by the instructions. And it works for different kinds of issues. And sometimes you can just plain get away with chlorine. But so it's almost always a little bit of an experiment. I was fairly fortunate with this, and it came out fine as far as I was concerned, fairly easily. And I sent it.
If somebody wanted to know what type of glue you used when you glued it all back together.
Tight Bond 2. Next up was the apron. The apron was steam bent oak. Here, the table originally was almost 42 inches in diameter, and that would be in my shop with a 14-inch bandsaw. That would be a little bit hairy with a bandsaw. So that was really the reason that I was using the router. But the apron was when I took it off, it kind of, as you would expect, sprung a little bit. So now I had to spring it back into position, and it wasn't particularly uniform in doing so. So I had to, it only had, I believe, 4 blocks when it was originally made. And I ended up making 16 new blocks where it came back together again. And of course, when you're looking at the underside, it looks like I left the seam open, but of course I didn't. That's where the seam of the apron was coming together. And that was actually the trickier part. There were cases where I was spreading and squeezing the apron, spreading in one location and squeezing in another location to get this to come into shape. But it was kind of fun.
Had you given any consideration, Chip, to the idea of re-steam bending it a little?
I did not. I didn't. Mostly because I thought this would work, and I tried it and it was working. So I said, I don't need to get out all that extra equipment to do that.
Thank you.
Did now that you've made the table a little bit smaller, the top, did you have to do anything with the apron to make it fit, or did it?
Yes.
You had to,
I had to trim the edges. So, the process was a combination of working from the center and one end and wrapping it around to the other end, and then cutting it off with a Dazuki pole saw to get it to fit properly. So there was a little trial and error to that, because I found out relatively quickly that if I didn't have enough of those blocks in place, I could have misjudged where and actually cut the apron off too short. So it was a little bit of trial and error, but not too much. And one half was done at a time.
Did you end up having to use dominoes to mate the apron ends together?
No, I did not do that.
So they're just butt jointed?
They're just butt jointed. They're not glued. Those are open joints there. So it looks kind of like it did when it was originally put together over 100 years ago. It's just that seam is just a solid seam now. But those 2 blocks are what are holding everything in place. And of course, there's a screw going down into the top and a screw going in into the apron.
Chip, one other question. You didn't mention whether this was going back to be a dining room table or whether it was going to be the cut down coffee table.
You know, it was to remain as a cut down coffee table for the client's granddaughter.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. So
I should mention that this is a fairly famous operation because John Carroll was my developer client, and he's responsible for several buildings in the Pearl District, one of which is named after his daughter, Mackenzie.
So this this slide was this was where I was having to do some forensic work on these slides and determine the best way to put this thing back together again. And so I made some notes in here. These holes are original holes that are intentionally oversized so that to allow for wood movement in this direction. This particular, and I mentioned these screws, those were really long screws and they were not in oversized holes. And by the way, I didn't mention this to you earlier, but these slides were nailed together. So that shouldn't have been there either. So every effort possible was made to make this tabletop immovable without accounting for wood movement, and the result was all the wood moved, and you saw all the glue joints that came apart. So basically, a lot of what I was doing here now is putting it back into its originally configured condition. So this was more about the results of the forensic work.
So you're putting those slides back on the bottom. They do go on the bottom then?
They do go on the bottom because that's how the tabletop was supported to the base.
Of course,
Like,
of course.
So
Thank
I
you.
had to, I had to work with what I had. So the rest of this, I took all of this stuff apart, put it back together again, cleaned it up, put it back together again, sanded it and whatnot. I chose a color that is made by Minwax, but this actual stain that I used was an M.L. Campbell product because M.L. Campbell and Minwax are both owned by Sherwin-Williams. So M.L. Campbell has the rights to the color formulation, and the English chestnut have found over time to be a really good match or a selection for oak. And so that's what it was stained with. And then because it's going to a young woman who's younger people have a tendency to use furniture differently than older folks. I'm just saying. So I chose a finish that was going to be more durable for a younger crowd than others, which is why I sprayed it with conversion varnish, which is the kind of material that is used on bathroom and kitchen cabinets because it's more scratch resistant than most finishes and more water resistant than most finishes. In fact, many furniture makers consider it nearly bulletproof.
How would you
Yep,
compare
can you,
that?
can
to
you
Paul
discuss
Walker?
why you use stain rather than dye?
I haven't, but I certainly can. Oak is very open pored, and it's not unusual to the stain that I used is an oil-bodied stain that is mixed with pigment, which I sometimes liken to ground dirt, but it's a little bit more, it's a little fancier than that, but it's a fairly heavy body. But they also add, different manufacturers add a certain amount of dye to some of these. So it's mostly pigment and oil, but some dye and oil. And the pigment, the reason for the pigment is it helps fill those very open pores. It looks very attractive on oak. So that's the biggest reason I do that. It's
And then
fast.
somebody wants to know what sequence of sanding grits did you use to get all the way down to 3,000?
Well, so now the finish is polished to 3,000. The wood is not. The wood went to 220 grit. And there are some people that will take wood to 150 grit if they're going to stain. I think I chose to take it up to 220. Now, and I think I mentioned before, some of the, and I'll come back to the P3000 in a minute. You couldn't really see it in any of these photographs, but these boards had a lot of cup and twist to them. So this tabletop, when it was glued back together again, was not dead flat, and it never will be dead flat. It is better than it was before. So, so that was part of the reason. I actually had to start with 80 and go to 150 and then to 220. But then I stopped at 220, applied the stain. I didn't tell you why I use ML Campbell instead of Minwax, even though it's a Minwax color. It dries faster, it cures faster.
And a couple of questions. We're getting a number of questions about the conversion varnish here. How does it compare to polyurethane? And does the conversion varnish require a spray application?
Let me answer the second question first. It does require spray application. I almost never use polyurethane because most of the time that I've seen polyurethane applied, it's applied way too heavy. And polyurethane, when it starts to come apart, delaminates, it chips badly. The layers come apart. I just don't like polyurethane. I used to, when I first started spraying, I was spraying nitrocellulose lacquer. Nitrocellulose lacquer is a wonderful product that was used through most of the 20th century as a replacement for shellac. It was more durable. It was production friendly. It was as repairable as shellac, but it is a little bit softer than, it's not as durable as some other finishes. And it doesn't cure as quickly as some of the more modern finishes. The more modern
and is
finishes,
conversion varnish a mixture? Is it like an epoxy almost, or something different? Is it a two-part mix?
it is a two-part mix. It is. However, it's basically the same two-part mix, almost the same two-part mix as nitrocellulose lacquer, but nitrocellulose lacquer is like shellac in that it is a chemical bond, and this is a mechanical bond. So those of you that have sat in on one of my finishing classes, you'll know what the difference is. The chemical bond has a tendency to melt in. The coat that you apply now puts the previous coat partially back into solution, as does shellac, but conversion varnish does not do that. And that's part of the reason that it's a more durable finish, but it is not as easily repairable.
Single coat or multiple coats, Chip?
Typically, I will do a seal coat that may or may not be the conversion varnish. Often it will be a coat of shellac first. I think in this particular case, I put a seal coat of conversion varnish and then two top coats. Now, when I polish out a piece of furniture like this, I start with let me back up a little bit. In between coats, if I'm spraying two coats in the same day within an hour of each other, I don't scuff sand in between because it's just not necessary. It's still while it may be dry to the touch and I can even stack to it, it is not, from a curing point of view, it is still plastic. So, and I learned that from Michael Dresner when he was down here. So, and so in this particular case, I may have put those two coats on in one day. I don't remember. If it's 2 different days, then I will scuff sand lightly at 320. But when I've finished with the final coat, I'll start out with maybe 500 and move up to 1,000, generally only 1,000. In this particular case, for some reason that I now don't remember, I took it to 3,000. And it may have been simply because I wanted a higher sheen to it. And that may be because I asked John Carroll what kind of a sheen he wanted, and he wanted a more glossy finish. I don't recall for sure, but that's generally the only reason I would take it up to 3,000. I've taken some finishes up even higher than that, generally with a polishing compound and a polishing machine, but generally I'll stop at 1,000. And I use a Merlon Abralon sanding pad, which is a spongy pad on a Mercom random orbit sander, where I can. Obviously, on the apron, I can't do that. So originally when I put all of this together, I thought, well, that's really interesting, but so what? So I decided to start putting together some observations and principles that I've gathered over time. And that first bullet applies to just about every project I can ever think of. Assess the project, develop a plan, and then be prepared to change the plan because you're going to run into surprises. A case in point, I'm working on a European-built white oak writing desk with a gallery and cubby holes on the top of it. I'm just working on the cubby hole. And all of the glue joints were high glue. Several of them came apart, some of it broke. And in one case, one of the side rails of this gallery that sits on top of the desk had apparently fallen off the top of something and broken that rail into a bunch of pieces. And the client attempted to repair it with E6000 glue. I don't know if you're familiar with it. I was not familiar with it, but it was used as both an adhesive and a filler. And of course, the husband, this was one of his favorite pieces of furniture. He happens to be Dutch, and it was acquired in Europe, maybe the Netherlands. I'm not sure where he acquired it, but it's one of his favorite pieces of furniture. And so he wanted it put back together again. So the very first thing I did was run a test. I bought a tube of E6000, which I wasn't familiar with, glued a couple of pieces of oak together, and then went to the manufacturer's website and said, okay, what do you recommend to reverse this adhesive? And I found I could use gasoline. But they gave me several options. I chose toluene, and it worked. So back to my earlier point, there are several adhesives that we use in our work that you may not think they're reversible, but if you work hard enough at it and do enough research, you might be able to find that you can reverse it. And this was one of them. So when I actually went to take this rail apart, this adhesive came apart easily, and it had been in place for years. But it also uncovered that the wood had splintered. So my plan was get the adhesive off, reglue it, reglue all of the joints, and I'd be done. Well, the surprise was the little pieces of wood with pieces missing. And so therefore the change in plan was to take that side of the gallery and cut off the very front of it and glue on a new piece and then redo all of the joineries and patch it back up. So you have to be, when you're doing this kind of work, you have to be prepared for surprises and be prepared to change the plan. I learned the second bullet early on, take photos for reference, because I find I have to go back. I have over the years, not since I've lived in Portland, but when I lived in the Southeast, I used to buy dining tables to refinish and resell. And my favorite was a dining table that had a butterfly leaf. And I don't know if you're familiar with them, but if you pull the table apart, the leaf folds up in the middle and folds in underneath the tabletop. Well, those are manufactured in a number of different ways. And the first one that I took apart, I didn't take pictures, and I had to scratch my head, how the heck does this go back together again? So now I take photographs, I match mark everything, whether I need to or not, just so that I know how things go back together again. The third bullet is maybe not so obvious, but I try to envision the final result, which is, honestly, I'm trying to imagine perfection. What is that going to look like? And then I work towards that vision. And I do have to remember that it is an antique, or it might be a vintage piece of furniture. I don't ever try to make a brand new piece of furniture out of an antique or a vintage piece of furniture. That's a fool's errand, and nobody's going to pay for that.
Can you talk a little bit about dent removal and dent removal, between the raw wood versus the finished?
So dent. So let's define a dent. A dent is where there's a depression in the wood and no fibers are broken. That's key. If there are no fibers broken, then hot water or an iron, basically the tip of an iron, and I tend to use a white terry cloth towel because it's very absorbent. You can steam that dent out. And it may take a few times. You may have to steam it, let it cool off, sand it, do it again. Rinse and repeat several times. But you can take a dent without broken fibers. You can take it out. If the fibers are broken, that's a different problem. You cannot fully remove a dent with broken fibers. In which case you have to resort to something else. You may fill with something. You may put a plug in. There's some inlay. There's a number of techniques for that.
How do you deal with it after it has finish on it? Start over?
To a certain degree. I actually have a table in my shop that I made and have shown at the Gathering of the Guilds for a number of years. I made it in 2013, and I took it down to a gallery earlier this year. And, you know, I had pulled it out. It had been under wraps for 2 years because of COVID. And I thought it was in pristine condition. I thought I put it away in pristine condition. But you quickly learn after you've taken a piece of furniture to a number of shows that that there are gremlins that wander the halls of a show, just as there are gremlins in your shop in the dark of night that result in little dings that you didn't remember putting there. So I had these fine little small dents from just barely casual use in that table. And when I took it down to the gallery and they looked at it and said, you know, this is really beautiful, but we're going to photograph it with a macro lens, and those things are going to look big. And I thought, okay, so I wanted you to see it, but I'm going to take it back and refinish it. So here I am refinishing my own work, which I thought I'd never have to do. And some of those dents, so I basically stripped the finish off so that I could address those dents. Now, if a piece of furniture is shellac finish, you have it a little bit easier because you can take some denatured alcohol and remove a certain amount of that finish where the dent is and steam that out and then reapply the shellac and alcohol, and it's a whole lot easier than if it's lacquer or conversion varnish. So I hope that helps. But the short answer is most of the time you have to refinish it. There's a bullet on there that says do no harm. I take that very seriously. I try to think through things, the steps that I take, so that I'm not doing more harm to the piece of furniture than I'm trying to correct. I have the owner of that writing desk I just talked about has an armoire from the 1700s in their foyer in their home in Portland, just barely north of Lake Oswego. And it has 2 big holes in the frieze. So I'm quite conscious of the fact that I'm going to be repairing that without doing any additional harm to it. And don't expect an antique to be made as precisely as a modern crafted piece of furniture. I've seen pieces of furniture where the legs were different thicknesses. And I just told you about those top boards in this particular table where the edges were not parallel. There's one bullet down there that's maybe a lousy attempt at humor, but I fix broken bones, I correct simple blemishes, but I don't use Botox. So I don't.
I laughed, Chip, when I read that. I just laughed. So it worked.
Okay, well, you know, I'm not trying to make perfection out of this old piece of furniture. This writing desk gallery that I'm telling you about earlier, it's cupped and twisted also. So, and I'm using wood that's in better shape than the wood that I'm replacing. So just don't get carried away. A common recommendation is don't try to make it perfect. Remember, it's an antique. And that goes for something that has some profiles to it. Older pieces of furniture often have a little bit of carving or some moldings or something of that nature. And if you don't get all of the grime or all of the stain out of those deep recesses, I don't sweat that. That's part of the character of the piece. And I don't have to reinvent that part of it when I put it back together again. And then just be open to out of the box solutions. And I should tell you that when I first came out here, I took, some of you may have heard of a fellow, a guild member by the name of Frank LaRock. He lives out in the Dalles. And I took a class from him at Franklin High School one day and found out he restored antiques. So I got to know Frank, and I actually went and spent the better part of 3 months, 2 days a week for 3 months, driving up to the Dells, working with him and coming back. So I learned an awful lot about approaches to restoring old pieces of furniture from Frank. So yeah, I'm really thankful for that knowledge, and so I try to pass that same kind of information along to others. So I think that was the end of the. I think that's the end of the slides.
Excellent job, Chip. Thank you.
Thank you again, Chip.
You're welcome. I need to figure out how to get my screen back now. Oh, here we go.
Thanks, Chip.
Any other questions? And they don't have to be related to this.
Thanks. That was a great presentation.
So Bill Cogswell just made note of the fact that Michael Dresden will be the speaker at the October 26th meeting of the Olympia Woodworkers Guild. And we're always invited to their meetings like they're invited to ours.
Oh, cool.
So if someone wants to hear from Michael, that's your opportunity.
You always have to plug the guild.
Will that be in our general newsletter for the month prior?
I sent it to Bland and he puts it in the weekly updates.
Terrific.
And give us some time, and this presentation will be on our website soon. So if anybody missed any tidbits or tips, we'll have it available.
Well, thanks a lot, Chip. This was really a nice presentation.
Thank
Very
you.
nice.
Yep.
Thanks, Chip.
Thanks, Chip.
You're welcome. Sure.
Thank you, Chip. That was very good.
Thank you, Chip.
Thank you.
Good
job.
That's all we got. And Chip was Johnny on the spot with timing. It's only 8:03, so we did a great job tonight. Thanks all, and we'll see you in October, although I'm not sure that I will be in attendance. I'll be traveling, but I'll ask one of my henchmen to MC that session.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thanks.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Chip.
Chip.
Night.